let's get started. If there's no questions, otherwise. I'm good? Okay. Okay, Oliver, take it away.
Hey, hi everybody.
Listen to the participants.
So the little bit that I'd probably like to say about the kind of work that I'd done is I'd been trying to find a way of I suppose like pushing against too many images or too much image in society, I guess, like with things such as TikTok and the kind of like just constant kind of like flurry of images. And I had this loop of like someone voguing in a club, and I thought that kind of I suppose like clubs are really places for that kind of metamorphosis that this kind of whole thing is about, or they're places where that kind of thing can happen. There's like a transformation, I suppose, of the person in the middle of the dance floor. When I was kind of like filming them, it's quite like voyeuristic, but at the same time, it's also, they were kind of being like transformed by light. So there was this kind of like really dark room and like this very kind of like fast green laser that was kind of like fluctuating on and off through someone's kind of movements that were also very fluid. And I really loved how that kind of, there's like this kind of these moments where it feels quite liquidy. So it feels like almost like a transformation of state, like from something quite bodily to something quite like extra, another sort of like position or another state. And then I kind of had this as a locked loop, and I wanted to have it like a GIF, I guess, like, or like a, yeah, I would say like a GIF or like a looped portrait. And then with that, I just wanted to reimagine the sound for it. So having it like a 3-minute video, sort of like maybe as a framework, using like music videos, so like 3 minutes, 3 minutes 30, that kind of thing. And then just essentially painting it. What I wanted to do was like try and paint it with sound. So I have like a sound effects app, so you can just use loads of these like cartoon sound effects and everything, and to try and reimagine like the club environment and try and like have my kind of my input, or like be able to kind of, yeah, it felt like trying to paint it with sound essentially, which is what I was really trying to do. But the transformation is really in the image, and then hopefully another transformation comes from being able to ascribe sort of like flashes of light or little moments where the hand hits in a particular way, trying to ascribe that to a certain sound, and then you're kind of like transforming or creating a new kind of sound and video relationship as well. And that's a lot of kind of what I was trying to do with it, was trying to have that moment where it became believable enough that you were being lulled into a new environment. And then at the end, I kind of just popped in the actual club track that was playing. And that's really, yeah, that's really it. That's kind of, that's me. That's kind of what I've got to say about it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I found it really interesting looking at your piece as well, just because it's kind of like it takes you into this different world almost. Just because you're like, oh, normally there's like a club track playing with voguing, and then it's like this kind of cool glitchy sound world that, yeah, it's really cool. Thanks for that insight, Oliver.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
I have a question. Really interesting piece. Thanks for sharing. In your info, you said that you came out of like a period exploring liminal zones. I'm quite interested in like the concept of liminality and, you know, these spaces or in between spaces. So maybe could you talk more about a bit about your interest in these liminal areas?
Yeah, definitely. I think like the liminal the liminal space is like something that keeps cropping up for me, whether it's like before, I suppose, like I'm really interested like by an artist called Mark Leckey who does a lot of work about like ritual or kind of like, yeah, the kind of in between. And I think the liminal zone that's kind of presented there was like, I don't know, there's I suppose like catching it in a loop as well and filming it in a loop makes it kind of liminal as well. It's like this in between place that I can't really access, and then in the loop I can kind of have it forever. So it's almost like weirdly fetishistic, I guess, in that sense, because I kind of having that in between moment in the club kind of forever, and I can kind of hold on to it, and I quite like that. I like when, yeah, and it's but yeah, and I don't know, the in between zones, and it's about sort of working into a state, I guess, like making the thing also like feels like that to a certain extent. Sometimes you kind of working yourself into an in between state where you spend so much time with like an image or a thing that you think is great, that you kind of are in an in between state of it kind of being the plain like dead thing on your computer to it kind of working into something else. So yeah, I was like hoping, and then like throwing so many sounds at it, hoping to kind of at some point conjure another feeling in me. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the liminality with it, or the in-between state is kind of working on a few different levels with it, I would say. Hopefully, if that's answered the question.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Thanks for that response. Cheers.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Can I ask a quick question, man? Just kind of following on from what you were saying there, which was really fascinating. But just specifically about how you think, how you were saying at the moment, like our very, very visual culture transforms how we feel and how we compose and, what music is. Like, I suppose, particularly with relation to what you were saying about how, when you said it feels like when you're in the GIF, it can go on forever. And that kind of change in temporal perception and how that relates to, I suppose, even 20 years ago, or during postmodernism, in this time of where there was already this big kind of hyperspace of images, and how specifically like digital culture has changed that, and maybe what that means for composition, or if we're already seeing that in any trends or in other work, particularly. I suppose maybe the relationship between like eternity, which is what you were talking about, and then kind of spatial blocks, which is more, and pastiche, which is more, the language of Homo.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's sick. I think like it's definitely trying not to be pastiche whatsoever. I think that's a really interesting thing to think about as well, like in terms of why I knew that I had to work with that loop was because there's no kind of like felt irony with it or felt pastiche or anything. It like it's like a moment of like sincerity. Well, it felt like relative sincerity to me, and like I just couldn't forget about it. I couldn't, like, after I'd filmed it, I just couldn't forget. Like I had to do something with it, and I just thought like, and I suppose that's kind of a good marker for pushing past like a lot of Pomo stuff is something to do with sincerity, or like, yeah, just kind of like a real desire for something to be quite like grounded and itself, instead of constantly not relevant, something else. What am I trying to say? Like sort of like ironizing or looking back or riffing off of something. I felt like it was adequately self-sustained, adequately like a moment in itself. And yeah, I don't know. And in terms of like the image thing, I thought it'd be nice to have like sounds that were abstract and there was a visual hook. So it kind of like, hopefully, I feel like we need more of that. I see so much good work and then I can't remember it. I've had to get to a point where now I have to be kind of like regimented with myself and have to spend a week where it's just like, well, I'm just going to watch this thing this week, or I'm just going to listen to this album this week, so that I have some kind of sense of continuity with work and things, instead of like just being in a constant like flow of just like images constantly passing through me. And I think then I start to lose the affect and lose the kind of feeling that these things can conjure from me. So in the moments when they do, and in the moments when it's like feels really special, like I don't think you should let go of them, and that's when you should kind of just hold on to it or whatever. So yeah, it's a very now thing, I think. So just, yeah, I wanted to try and just turn it on its head, hopefully. So I don't know if that answers the question, if that's of any use, but hopefully.
Yeah, totally. I'm really, really excited to see it. Thank you. Yeah, fantastic.
Nice. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Right, aRzu, if you want to take the lead now.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm aRzu. I'm based in Brussels, working in sound and sound design for animation film. It's particular because I have an animation film background, so it's kind of continued from there. So in general, I guess I'm interested in storytelling or narratively kind of conceptualized sound pieces. So I always try to look for some kind of like a narrative guideline. And the piece that I'm presenting here, which is called Fragile Egos, I look for different kinds of interactions between, I guess, egos as a floating object. So there is a visual component with like circles, either interacting or just acting on them by themselves. And it's an ongoing research that will continue. So far, there are 4 pieces out, and here I have 2. And I investigate those with words. So I try to write about the interaction from an inside-out perspective, or from a more poetic perspective, I guess. So it's not like this person met this person, but more abstract that way. And I researched that within how sound as a composition works, and how it can support that poem or that text or that feeling, and how it can also put it to another narrative layer of that is only possible to perceive on a sonic level. So that is more or less my piece. In general, I work a lot with field recordings and processed sound, not necessarily with a musical idea, but of course, sometimes you have sort of something musical kind of emerging. What else can I think of? Actually, that's all I can think of for this project. So bring on questions if you have some.
Thanks. I have a question, actually. How does your animation background influence your composition and sound? And does it influence it or not really?
Yeah, no, it does immensely. I mean, before animation, I actually was doing theater even. So I think a lot of that has something about movement and embodiment, which is like this plastic word we can use forever, but it's something about giving a body emotion and a character. So film and theater for me is actually sort of another level of making music, or finding rhythm and telling stories in that way, which is an endlessly fascinating procedure for me, because it's about transmitting whatever we want to actually communicate to the world. So it influences it a lot, because of what animation also made makes possible still, actually, because I still use it in my artistic work, is to see the world like without attachments. Like everything is possible. You don't have to obey by any physical laws or anything, which of course sound and music also do allow for. And for me, animation doesn't work without sound. And I do sound now for animation, so I see like how a still image can be absolutely flat, but if you you know, so like if you put the right sounds to it, or even a music piece, it will become this very different creature basically by itself. So I guess in terms of thinking in time and space or duration within composition, it does have a big influence, because yeah, it's about like taking time and giving space, like the elements you want to communicate some space. So yeah, I guess in theater it gives me more this like love for words. So I do really love using language, not just English, but languages that I am capable of accessing, because words are for me like very, yeah, for us all obviously, like we're using them right now, but very yeah, important carriers of information, and to play around with that is something that I love to do. And even though it kind of does a bit like this voiceover type of thing, it can also become just like a sonic element of just repeating a syllable, or, you know, becoming a sound itself. In this case, or in the Fragile Egos, I didn't go for that only, but there is a potential for that as well, or like the way that things are said. And yeah, so I think that's how it influences it.
Nice. That's really fascinating. I mean, I can see that in the piece Fragile Egos. I feel like there's really a lot to do with characters and kind of like personalities, but also like I feel like you do use sounds, like vocal sounds, as like little sound worlds, which is, I think, really fascinating. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Super happy. Well, the animation, I know that I would love to actually work with an animator by themselves. So because I really love this idea of having these circles, like the simplest thing that can be a body actually, to become much more expressive. But that's like for the future. At the moment, it's also building those tales or stories, whatever. But yeah, it's indeed very interesting turf. Yeah.
Great. I'm looking forward to seeing what it becomes and how it
Yeah.
evolves. Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me here, and yeah, super excited.
Thanks. Does anyone have any other questions for aRzu? Okay.
You can come around later.
Yeah, exactly. If something pops to mind, pop in the chat or say later. But yeah, thanks a lot.
I was just going to say, maybe we'll have a visual artist watching the concert, and you might get a potential collaborator
Yeah.
in the future.
Exactly.
My email is online.
Yeah, exactly. If anyone also has like any future projects that they want to let us know about, we're always keen to see what people are doing, even if we're not necessarily putting on another concert. So especially if it's got to do something with the pieces we've shown. So always keen to see what's happening next. Okay, Simon, if you want to go next.
Hello, how are you doing? Yeah, so my piece started, it was probably about 2 years ago now, and I was starting a PhD at the Royal Northern College of Music that September, and I was, at the time I was thinking I was going to be researching methods of combining acoustic and electronic sound, but specifically from the angle of just trying to create a real sense of coherence between the acoustic electronic sound. I often find in concerts that use these kind of things, you can get a kind of unintended juxtaposition almost between the kind of qualities of the two things. So I was really looking into ways of sort of bridging that. And I kind of realized a little while later, I was really trying to look at ways of source bonding electronic sounds to acoustic instruments. But I didn't quite have the sort of language to say that at the time. But I was actually in Belgium at a workshop a few months before I started. So I just very casually did a little study with this saxophone player that I met there. And we just tried to see if we could take an completely acoustic saxophone tone and then electronically move it over an audience. And then the saxophonist would walk behind the audience while the sound was slowly moving, and then kind of catch it on the other side. So it was just really fun and quite a casual thing to do. But the results were really interesting and really kind of set me off on this slightly different path. So we used 5 different tones, or 5 different playing techniques, I should say, and they all kind of gave slightly different results. So the first tone was just an ordinary tone, just an ordinary sax tone in the middle of the register. And what I did was I recorded a sample like the day before of this same tone. Then he would play it. Then I'd fade in that sample, then pan it across the room with a surround sound Ableton panner thing, and then you pick it up. But with the ordinary tone, it didn't blend well at all. As soon as I started to fade up the sample, you could hear the direction changing as the speakers came up, and there was just a difference in quality of timbre. So it just didn't work basically. I mean, it still made an interesting effect, but you could see the joins quite easily. But something really interesting happened with the second tone, because I just asked him to play the highest note that he could, which was obviously a harmonic. And then when the very first time we tested this, I faded in the harmonic, and I actually thought the sample hadn't triggered because it was so seamless with the tone. There was like the direction problem with the first tone didn't exist, and the timbre problem didn't exist. I didn't know why at the time, but I do know why now, so I'll explain in a second. And then, so there were two other tones, which I'll just skip these and go to the fifth tone, which was probably the most interesting one. So I'd not actually seen this technique before at the time, but he played a really low note. I think it was a low B on the saxophone, and then he hummed a fifth higher. And then this creates the Tartini effect, or the missing fundamental effect. So the brain fills in a pitch an octave lower, so you actually hear three tones. So this is a kind of psychoacoustic effect. So what I ended up doing with that sample was sort of cross-fading it with a synthesized subtone. So you ended up getting this sort of blending of acoustic sound to and then psychoacoustic sound, if that makes sense. Yeah, and then I found out later that the reason the harmonic blended in this way is because like a harmonic obviously doesn't have an overtone series, and the brain will localize sounds in part because of the extra information that's in the overtone series. So when a sound comes to our ears, the difference that it takes to come around the head gives us some signals for where the sound is in space, but there's less information within a harmonic than there is in a complex tone, so we can't calculate the location. There are other reasons as well, like phase differences and things like that. And then also the timbre difference. It's much easier for recording equipment to record a harmonic because it's a simple tone, and it's much easier to reproduce through speakers. Whereas a complex tone on a saxophone is so complex, it's difficult to pick up and then reproduce. So anyway, yeah, this sort of set me off on this path of basically researching and looking up acoustic and psychoacoustic theory, and then figuring out ways to sort of put this into composition. And then, so one of my first pieces for the PhD, which was just over a year ago now, actually, it was about 2 weeks before lockdown or 3 weeks before lockdown, I think. So I was quite lucky that it wasn't a few weeks later, otherwise it never would have happened. But I had 5 clarinet players all around the space, and they were passing tones over one another. So there were 16 soundscapes altogether. And I started off with the sort of highest note on the clarinet, and then each soundscape got lower and denser. And I used all kinds of, beats and combination tones and difference tones, and just all these kind of techniques to try and create this blending of acoustic and electronic sound. And then, now I'm going to get to the piece that's actually getting played in this concert, because this ended up being the second movement, because I ended up making a first movement, which is what I've sent to you guys. Because I kind of realized the second movement, what I've just explained, this is all about sound moving around an audience. So I thought, well, it'd be nice if the first movement would be an audience moving through sound. So this was a purely acousmatic piece, and I had all the samples from working on the second movement anyway. So I just, I'm sure most of you have seen it, or some of you, but have you seen the Max MSP patch where you have the harmonic series and the faders, and you're pulling the faders and it homogenizes the sound? So it was basically, I've got, I'll post, actually, I wrote a blog entry for Leeds Uni where I explain all this. So it's here, and within that is a link to the Max MSP patch I'm talking about. So I basically just wanted to make a sort of human version of that Max MSP patch. So I just layered up like endless clarinet samples in relation to the harmonic series, and then the idea is the audience moves around and you get a slightly different timbre or sort of variation of the harmonic series as you walk around the space. But then I started kind of layering up the more kind of distant notes on the overtone series. So yeah, I started layering up with like multiphonics and all these things. So you get this like different sense of homogenization and coherence with the different kind of sounds. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm up to now. I've been working on 2 more sound sculptures. I've just finished one for a trombone, which has gone really well. It's gone in quite a different direction as well. It's less about kind of coherence between the electronic and acoustic sounds, and more about I don't know what it's about. But I've just finished the French horn one as well. So yeah, it's set me off on a really interesting path, and I'm hoping to create at least the sound sculpture for each instrument family of the orchestra. I've already done winds and brass, so I'll hopefully do strings and voices, and I've got an idea for a percussion one that should be quite interesting. And then hopefully one for orchestra eventually. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Amazing. Thanks a lot. That's really interesting. It's funny because I play the sax as well, so when you explained it all with the sax context, I was like, oh right, okay, yeah. It's quite interesting. I never knew that humming a fifth above actually created like an illusion. Because obviously I know what it sounds like, but I didn't realize it was an illusion. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I can send you a couple of videos. There's a saxophonist beatboxer who explains it really well.
Nice.
I'll find it now.
Sure. Yeah, send it in the chat so for everyone can see. Does anyone else have any questions for Simon?
It's really interesting hearing about your work in more detail and all the psychoacoustic effects. I'm just like hungry to be in person and to hear this the spatialization, and we would have our speaker set up, but it's nice to be able to at least present it online and people can get a taste of your work, Simon, so thank you.
That's the thing, it really puts space as like the main parameter, but then that just doesn't come across in stereo record. It's like listening to Beethoven with all the melodies gone or something. It's just like half of the music's missing. But yeah, that's what it is.
Nice. If no one has any other questions.
Yeah, I was just gonna. Yeah, sorry, Simon. I was just gonna ask: is there any other kind of like psychoacoustic effects that you'd come across during these kind of experiments, or with the different instruments, or any of the instruments that you've been working with? Just kind of effects that you come across.
Yeah, the kind of spectralists from the 70s, like Grise and people like that, they've really already pioneered a lot of this stuff. There's a guy called Alvin Lucier, who I'm sure many of you heard of him. He's done loads of kind of studies in etudes and things like that. So there's a whole literature based around this kind of thing. I'd say using it to kind of try and blend acoustic and electronic sounds a bit more esoteric, but even Alvin Lucier has done kind of lots of stuff with that. He wrote a piece for, I think, sine waves and flutes, where he uses beating patterns to sort of blend the 2 tones together. So there's lots of literature. Yeah, again, I can send. I've got so that blog that I just put, I've got like a longer paper where I do like I left the literature out of that because it's just a short blog, but I can post you that, and then there's lots of sources and things like that in there.
Sounds great. Yeah, if anyone is interested in that sort of stuff, it would be good to share the links. We can also just share the links afterwards in an email if you like, because we're aware that the links get lost in the Zoom, so I'll just copy paste whatever you're pasting. Okay, shall we move on to Alastair?
Cool. Hi everyone, how's it going? And thank you so much everyone for having me and for featuring this. It's really exciting to be actually a gig, not just a gig, but a gig in Scotland. Amazing. Yeah, incredible. Yeah, so the piece that we're presenting in an excerpt of our opera Woad, which is the third in a cycle of 4 fashion operas, which explore explore what drama might be in our in contemporary society, or how certain kind of technological changes and certain cosmological discoveries might affect what theatre could be now and in the future. And just, I suppose, instead of going into that, though, it might be more interesting to pick up on what you was talking about the Fork in Paths project, which we were doing. One of my colleagues, Jenny, and I were doing a presentation last week there, which kind of intersects with some of the ideas in Woad, or at least that project grew out of some of the things that Woad had thrown up, as it were. So the opera is about, I don't know if anybody knows this. Do you know the old song about Tam Lin? It's an old folk song. You shall not go to Catterhawk, because old Tam Lin is there. It's amazing. It's incredible. It's like watching the most exciting film in this song, and it goes on for about 10 minutes. And it has these wonderful characters in it, particularly the heroine Jenny, who's like this incredible character, jumping over walls, like running around, just laughing at people. And yeah, so she's kind of the heroine of the poem. But and we wanted to do a piece that was an adaptation to explore what that might mean, but particularly because Tam Lin is a poem about transformation. It's about a metamorphosis. So basically what happens in the poem is that there's this guy called Tam Lin, obviously, who's been bewitched by the Queen of the Fairies. And that evening they're offering him up to Satan so that he's going to get eaten, and the only way that she can save him is if she holds on to him like throughout the night, and no matter what happens. You probably heard the story in some kind of variant, and during that night he transforms into first a lion, and then a snake, and then a tiny little piece of dust, and then a burning piece of coal, and then finally into this kind of naked crying version of himself, and then back into himself again. But so the idea of doing an adaptation then is how would you do a piece that is about metamorphosis? Actually, how would you dramatize metamorphosis, which is the nature of translation and adaptation anyway? Like, how would you bring that to the fore? And we wanted to use that to address this theme of, and this brings us back to the Fork in Paths project, of how do you dramatize contingency? How do you rise to the challenge of what contingency presents itself with? And so by contingency, I would define it according to this distinction drawn by the philosopher Quentin aRzu, who talks about the difference between virtuality and potentiality. So the way he describes it kind of is that say it's the difference between indeterminacy and contingency. So indeterminacy is when you get, or potentiality is when you get one of the options within a set of parameters. If you roll the dice, you get somewhere between 1 and 6. Whereas contingency is when you transform the transcendental parameters altogether and you get a new option. You get an option that wasn't there before. So like in the sense of the dice, it would be the dice growing a 7th side, which would mean in this term, the total transformation of the law, total inversion of the laws of physics even. But it's this as a concept, I think, is really important for art at the moment, especially when, within late capitalism, it feels like everything that you do can get subsumed back into the system as another referent or part of that structure or totality. And that concept of contingency, in which, the idea of an autonomy outside the structure, is really important. And aRzu says that's the nature of the external world. But I think there's a lot of other things happening at the moment in technology and, like I say, in cosmology that allow us to kind of try to rise to that challenge and do. So the idea then is, how do you ever incorporate that into a piece? Because as soon as you do, it's going to always become one of a number of things. It's going to become just indeterminacy. Not just, there's nothing wrong with indeterminacy. Indeterminacy is great. It's like, it's like total desert, but it won't be contingency anymore. Or it becomes a symbol of that, just something that kind of stands in for it. And in that sense, very much like when anybody ever talks about using the Lacanian real, the contingency is a similar thing. It's something that can't be within the work. It can't be within the totality of the work structure. So you can't even have something standing in for it. Or it goes back to, again, older ideas of just arbitrariness and spatialization and not spatialization in the sense that we were talking about earlier, but in the sense of, block temporality, like Stravinsky blocks. So how do you do that? I don't really know. I think both the pieces that we wrote in it have kind of failed, but offered up other examples. And the main technique that I've started using is this mix of total determinate complex notation. So like, in the this kind of tradition, this kind of notation, tradition of new complexity, but with always the working option of that anything about it can be changed. So that it's not that anything this again comes from another concept in fashion opera more generally, which is the idea that you can use alienation as a tool against itself to separate things out, and so have them as equal absolutes. So that in that sense, you don't need to make a decision between different philosophies of composition. How, for instance, different compositional techniques imply different, I suppose, philosophies of music. Spectralism might imply that it was in the like at the phenomenology of the listener. I think I'm just guessing, or like another, like something like modernism might claim it was in the score. Just to say that actually, because especially now in the world of multiverses and superpositions and multiple infinities, we can actually think that quite differently and think that each stage of the process could be a total absolute in itself. And so with it, you then get this. You get some kind of tension between composition, performance, realization, each completely separate, and therefore, but with its own strategies. So that was one. There were a few others. You'll see, maybe see. I know I'm kind of running out of time here, so maybe that's a kind of overview. And we'll watch it tomorrow and maybe speak about it some more. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alastair. I mean, I think with everyone here, I'm aware that you've not seen each other's pieces. So it's quite interesting that, hear you talk about it and then kind of seeing what other people might imagine. But it's great to have an explanation of something before we watch it. And I think that was really insightful, especially into the world of fashion opera, which I've not really... I don't know if everyone has dove into that before, but I feel like it's a niche that isn't very commonly discussed. So it's really good to hear about that. Does anyone have any questions for Alastair? Okay, well, if you think of any, there's always a bit of time later. But thanks a lot, Alastair. That was really insightful. Looking forward to it tomorrow. Next, I think last on our list, Cameron, would you like to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. I also definitely will have questions for people. I don't know about others, but they're kind of percolating, Hopefully they'll get out into sentences before we end. So I'm a composer from the northeast of England. I'm currently in North Yorkshire, and I'm doing a PhD at the minute at the University of York. And this piece that I've got here, Canon X, was created in collaboration with Des Clark, who I think actually did something for Sound Thought at some point. I was talking to him about it.
He had an installation, maybe 2018. Really cool interactive one, yeah.
Des does all sorts of things, is why I was thinking about this. So in this piece, he's playing oboe in this recording, but he's a great composer. He's a brilliant improviser. He makes like generative art. His house is filled with big plotters for like ink drawings, and just a great, really interesting guy. And so this piece was made in collaboration with Des. We were in lockdown, not able to do lots of the things that we'd been kind of both expecting to do, and this piece came about in its place. And so we wanted to make something that made sense to be made in a world where we were never going to meet physically, and still haven't since we've made it, So what we ended up doing was like sending things back and forth and working and talking about ideas. And Des has this interest in like really high density improvisation with just a lot of sound and color and material coming and going and being present. And what we came up with is this kind of like timeline of a score, which is, I guess, a score, but as much just a sort of guideline for improvisation. And the way we realized it is one performer moves like from left to right, and one moves from right to left. And in this case, Des is improvising with his oboe just in real time, but against coded sounds that I've made using samples from Des that I kind of collected from him. So I guess a little bit similar, like Simon, some of the stuff you were saying, that there's there's like a melding of sounds where it'll be a sound that Des did make, but 2 weeks prior, that's been chopped up and transformed, and now he's hearing it and like interacting with it and passing by it. And so, yeah, it makes this really interesting effect where like you can tell that both parts have their kind of agendas and moving in their directions, and they are both interacting with each other in a way, but also they're kind of separate at the same time, especially in this particular performance, because in order to kind of make it work, inevitably we kind of had to do some bits of things being made in advance. I've done this piece live since, and it does work. It works really well. It's really interesting being able to interact and kind of watch each other more. But with this performance, it's quite weird listening to it actually, because some stuff you kind of listen to it and you think like, how did we manage to make it seem like we were totally really paying attention to each other there, when like I sent Des my part having already made it in its entirety, and he played back on top of this bit. So yeah, it makes this really interesting exploration of kind of sound coming in and out and being live performed or being pre-made and being chopped up by the code, or Des doing some brilliant crazy stuff with his oboe. Yeah, that's pretty much that's what it is in a very short kind of burst. Yeah.
Amazing. Great. Yeah, and what software did you use to chop things up?
So for this one, I've been using, it's called Sonic Pi, which some people might be familiar with. It's really like a large part of it is made for people to learn how to code with it, and it is partly what I was using it for. I don't really know much about code at all. 18 months ago maybe, but I thought it was something I'd like to explore. It has a lot of similarities with Super Collider, but it's a bit simpler and like color coded so that you can spot your mistakes when things are going badly wrong and you have no idea what's happening, which is a big part of me coding at least. So yeah, it lets you, it's actually really quite powerful, but you sometimes have to be a bit creative about how you get it to do things you want to do. But actually I found that kind of useful, like having to get around stuff or make it do what I want to do. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I've only been familiar with Super Collider before, really, and some title coding as well. I think there's an online, but I've never heard of that, so that's really useful.
It's free and it's really easy to download. It's made for like little Raspberry Pi machines is what it's meant for, but it works on pretty much anything as a result. So
amazing.
We recommend just exploring.
Do you mind sending the link in the chat so that
Yeah,
we can send it around after? I'm sure that other people might be interested in that as well. Right, I mean, does anyone have any questions for Cameron or any of the other artists now that we've come to kind of the last 10 minutes of our talk?
I was going to ask Cameron, had you maybe envisaged this as like a series with different instruments, like the Canon piece or pieces?
Yeah, it's definitely open and possible. Like I say, I did a live performance last year, and it was a saxophonist doing it, and that involves like remaking some of the samples and stuff, to make the right kind of sounds work. I think each version of this piece as it comes will probably be quite different, and I would try and make it as different as I can, because like the oboe was great for, so the stuff that worked really well were like multiphonics, and a lot of airy, breathy sounds and things were really nice and malleable. Different instruments will have different strengths, so yeah, it will definitely develop, I think.
Amazing. Yeah, I've also been exploring kind of, I mean, I guess this is a question to anyone actually who's working with kind of acoustics in a room. But I've been working on a piece also for any instrument which works with improvisation upon each other. So it's like a guided improvisation for any instrument, which is like the improvisations are recorded and then played back into the room again and again until it merges with the room frequencies. And then the player at the end will improvise to their material, but it's morphed, so it doesn't really sound like it did at the start anymore. Which is, I mean, this is a direct reference to Alvin Lucier. It's called "I Am Sitting in a Room With," and then the instrument that is playing. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, has anyone else explored kind of like, or thought about the space that they maybe put their performance in, or their sound world sounds in, and based on like how that, like the reverb of a space, and the this also goes for like anyone who just has purely fixed media stuff. I'm just wondering, like, have you ever thought about like the acoustics of an exhibition space?
Yeah, the thing I'm working on now for the two French horns, I've not managed to actually perform it live yet for obvious reasons. But so one passage in that, they play a melody, and then so I've recorded that melody, and then I've taken each note, and then time stretched it kind of indefinitely, layered it up, and then used a filter to filter out the fundamental frequency, and then layered up each note of the melody, if that makes sense. And then in the room, the idea will be that they just repeat this melody, and then in the background, I'm going to fade in these samples, and then slowly open the filter. And my idea is that I'm trying to kind of source bond, whereas with the first piece, I tried to source bond the electronics to the instruments. Now I'm trying to source bond the electronics to the acoustics of the room. So it'll be like the resonances that are being created by the melody will kind of be close in around the audience, if that kind of makes sense. It's kind of an experiment. I don't quite know how it's going to work. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about at the minute is like, yeah, really trying to sort of, just manipulate the room acoustics in various kind of ways and things like that.
I think it's difficult as well, having been, in lockdown for the past year or so, and not being able to design pieces with these spaces, or with access to these spaces, or you can have them in mind, but it's not the same. We've all had to deal with that in various ways, but hopefully not too much longer. We can get back to spatialization in person, as obviously it's very important for all of us, especially Simon, in your project.
Yeah, aRzu.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, I find it also very interesting because I'm working also on an installation at the moment, and like did previous installations, and I like to work with different material as well that is basically sounding, but it's not an instrument or it's not a musician, but it's just a piece of paper or a piece of like also very beloved tool is transducers to put on surfaces and stuff. So like when you have this thing, and at the moment I'm working with foils that also reflect, so there's a visual stimuli as well, which I think, I don't know, maybe also working so strongly with visual, I always feel like everything you see is also related to your sonic experience. I mean, it is anyway a multisensorial thing to go into a space, into a concert, into an exhibition or an installation. But they also are quite crunchy. So it's always very interesting to think about, especially an installation where you don't know how many people really are there. I mean, now you do because of COVID, you just know, okay, there's 5 people going in this tour. But before that, you didn't know, and then how they're going to stand and what they're going to activate in that. But I do find that non-control actually also very intriguing. So I'm not sure how it is for musicians and composers for music pieces where there is so much need for, this is my piece and I want you to experience this piece. But in my case, it's like, it's really an interactive thing without necessarily being Arduino programmed. When you touch this, this will happen. But like, yeah, bound to the physicality of the space, it does happen. Anything can happen. So I find this like question very interesting, and also, yeah, thinking about I guess the resonance of every single object that you place there, even, I don't know, even a mixer or something. Yeah,
kind of talking about like unamplified and how that, because I always think about like, because there's always a performance, right, happening in a room, but then that acoustic always gets, like you said, you don't know how many people are going to be there, but that always, like, who is going to be there and how many people are going to be there really influences the acoustic as well, I think, and adds to it or takes away from it, because the sound bounces off differently. So this is just something I've really been contemplating, and you're totally right, like, just objects, or like what does the floor made of that you walk on, you know, which can also influence the sonic experience. So it's super interesting. Yeah. Anyone else? Or about any of the pieces, really?
Can I just jump in on this kind of question as well? Because it's something else I find very fascinating, but from maybe just a very different perspective of how, you know, when you see, if you take something even as determinate as like a, you know, an opera, and you see it composed and you see it performed in a different space, whether it's, you know, immersive or not. Some of them have been immersive, some of them hasn't, but it's a completely different piece, which is quite it's maybe in some ways upsetting as a composer, because maybe the whole time it wasn't really about your piece, it was about the room or about the people on the day, you know, but also quite yeah, I don't know, fascinating and liberating, especially with these ideas of, you know, contingency and saying what happens beyond the possible. And again, this is something I'm not entirely sure about, how do you anticipate that? How do you anticipate the unanticipatable in a piece without it becoming, you know, without it either breaking down the piece altogether and it just becoming nonsense, or you're not doing it? And the only answer I've come up to that is this idea of like, total structure, like having something so structured that it becomes ridiculous, becomes almost like too weighted, and descends into the and kind of collapses at points beneath into these breaks that can be then filled on the day by whatever's happening there. This kind of what becomes almost like a cyborg, really. It's a mix of like space and the people involved, the individuals and the score. And I'm not sure, I think there's something probably much more interesting within that, but just in like particularly in terms of, you know, some of the things the others have been talking about, but just from this idea of thinking of it not in the work itself, but in the structure of the work that then engages with the world. That's yeah, that was the kind of solution that I got to.
Nice. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, like, it's funny what you say about that the piece is completely different when it comes down to the space, because in a way, like, there's kind of a beauty in that unpredictability, you know. And I feel like, I mean, I love unpredictability and happy accidents in sound and in music and in art. So I really like to embrace the fact that if something feels different, it's good, because then that means like there's a different experience every time. And I think like giving up that control is quite hard sometimes, depending on what medium you compose for. So like, you know, if you compose for a classical setting like a string quartet or an opera, or it's quite difficult to admit that you can't control everything, even though you spent so much time obsessing about the sounds and the arrangement of the sounds as well. But yeah, I mean, this is not a question. This is just me being really excited about this topic. But yeah, it's really
also maybe that's what makes string quartets interesting in the first place, is that they, you know, they're already in this kind of, you know, supposedly this thing that's entirely removed from human experience, this kind of, you know, transcendent thing, but they're already existing in this dialectic with sweat and, you know, and state and, you know, whatever's going on in everybody's mind at the moment, which is that kind of, you know, I don't know, cheese and pickle combination, you know, or what is it in Twin Peaks, you know, ham and maple syrup combo, you know, it collides with that. That's maybe what always made it interesting. Even like particularly the kind of more like these more supposedly controlled things.
Exactly. Any more comments or questions?
Yeah, actually, I had one for Cameron. So if I understood correctly, it is also that basically you were saying that Des is playing against the samples that he has given you from previous recordings. So It's not really a question. It was just like something where I thought it's kind of funny because he's basically playing against the past self that he also doesn't have control about because he submitted a version of himself or a version of his music to your capable hands and you have done something. And he now has to combat that in a way, in the space. Is that it?
Yeah, exactly. And to try and kind of enhance that, like we'd send each other as we were kind of going through iterations of this. Every time we had something new we wanted to explore, we'd send a few kind of very similar takes, I guess, so that like either of us, but like Des could have an inclination about what you might be coming up with some of the time, but it's never quite the same one and it's not quite going to be the same thing, so that like the final take that we've got here is Des's like first interaction with this particular like set of sounds, but you know there is some expectation of what's to come because he has seen the piece before and has gone through things. So there's even like a level of interaction with past sounds and concepts that aren't even present in the final work at all.
Great, thanks. All right, it's gone bang on 8 o'clock. One last chance to ask questions or pass any comments. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for everyone for attending, and for those of you who volunteered to speak, thanks a lot as well. I'm really looking forward to watching the concerts tomorrow. I hope you all enjoy it as well. And thanks a lot for sharing and talking. It was really nice to meet all of you and to talk to you again if I've met you before. So yeah, big applause for everyone.
Yeah, that was super interesting chat. So thanks everyone for sharing, talking about your work, and thanks for the audience for coming to hear as well. So great, thank you everyone. Hopefully to see you at the concerts on Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah, right. Bye. Bye.
Thanks so much. See you tomorrow.